We all know about 1066 and the Norman invasion. It's a core part of our national story in England, and it's one of the most significant events in medieval history. It's part of our story to think of 1066 as the last invasion of England. We don't like to think of the 1688 invasion by William of Orange as an invasion, and we call it the Glorious Revolution. We don't count invasions by the Scots because no one takes that seriously, and neither do we count Henry Tudor's invasion of 1485 because we just don't. There's another invasion that isn't part of our national story, in my experience at least. Of course, if you're into medieval history, then you will know about it, but the general public don't. And that's surprising because it took place during the reign of King John, and he is very much part of our national story. We all know about the uppity barons and the Magna Carta and all that, but we call the conflict the First Barons' War. His son Henry III had another one of those. But most people don't know that for a time we had King John in the north, while King Louis of England ruled over London and the south. Perhaps it's no wonder we don't like to remember, because on the face of it, it's pretty embarrassing. This conflict features in the second novel in my series, The Immortal Night Chronicles, so if you've read that, of course you'll know all about it. Anyway, how did we get into this conflict? As I outlined in my video on King John, he really annoyed a lot of his nobility and they rebelled against him. And then they offered the throne to Prince Louis, the son of Philip II, the King of France. This sort of thing wasn't that unusual in the medieval period. Great lords would take up arms for one rival king over another. And in this case, it was an admission that their attempt to control John with what we call the Magna Carta had failed, and also that they lacked the military strength to beat him on their own. Prince Louis said thank you very much and turned up with an army. This had been on the cards for a while, and as I said in my King John video, Philip II had seriously considered an invasion a few years earlier. And before Prince Louis invaded in force, a few French soldiers had already arrived. In the winter of 1215, 1216, about 250 French knights, along with about as many crossbowmen and their support troops and servants, had come across, but they were too few in number to do much, so they just sat about in rebel-held London. The medieval biography, The History of William Marshall, says this about the vanguard, quote, "The French rabble drank many a barrel and cask of fine wine. Full of boasting, they said England was theirs, and the English would have to quit the land for they had no right to it." End quote. Prince Louis planned to bring his army over in January, and then he swore it would arrive by Easter, and finally landed on the 21st of May in Kent, on the south coast opposite France. He brought about 1,200 knights in 800 ships. Those knights all had their own men-at-arms, of course, as well as servants and horses, so this is a serious force by medieval standards. John brought his fleet of ships down to stop them, but God cursed the English with a great storm, and it wrecked his fleet and blew the survivors away. The same winds brought the French swiftly across the Channel. First man off his ships, Prince Louis leapt from his boat into the surf, where a local priest was waiting to greet him. Louis kissed the proffered crucifix and marched on into his new kingdom. John could have brought his army to attack Louis here on the coast, but he was not sure he could trust his foreign mercenary force to do the job. It wasn't just John's paranoia, as William the Marshal also apparently advised him to withdraw for now, and they rode west, abandoning Hastings and Pevensey castles, while Louis marched on London. For now, he ignored the great fortress of Dover and instead took Canterbury and Rochester, while rebel barons began arriving to pay homage to him. On the 2nd of June, he was received with great rejoicing by the treacherous merchants of London, and the burghers swore fealty to the new king in St. Paul's. The Tower of London held out for King John, but like Dover, Louis just ignored them for now. Let the loyal men stay in their fortress because everyone was sure the whole kingdom would soon fall. Louis's army now followed John's across the country, taking the castles of Reigate, Guildford and Farnham, and wherever he captured John loyalists, he hanged them. John, with the ever-loyal William the Marshal, retreated 120 miles west to Winchester, the former capital of England. It looked like John was going to make a stand there, but before Louis arrived, John ran away, and abandoned the city and the castle, and they surrendered. Louis captured more castles, getting as far west as Marlborough in Wiltshire and taking the castle, which was a personal possession of John's. So that meant almost the entire south of England was in French hands, including London, not counting Somerset, Devon and Cornwall, which no one did. This time was a bit of a low ebb for John. Many of his mercenaries, unpaid and on the losing side, took what little loot they had left and went home to the Low Countries or wherever. Most of the remaining loyal earls abandoned him, like the Earl of Salisbury and Warren. They both went over to Louis. Only the Earls of Chester and Derby remained loyal, and William Marshal, of course, who was the Earl of Pembroke. Their core lands remained unthreatened by the invasion, for now at least, and possibly explained why they were willing to hold out. John had few cities and forces left, most of them in the Midlands, but within French and rebel-held territory, he still held Windsor and Dover. John had spent a fortune making Dover Castle a magnificent and powerful fortress, and now that investment was paying off, because Louis' siege there took much of his resources. Defending Dover Castle was the highly experienced Hubert de Burgh, with about 140 knights and their supporting soldiers and servants, and a great many supplies. There were attacks and undermining attempts and attempts to storm the walls, and towers crumbled, and after 12 weeks they called a truce. While the French were busy at Dover, John marched all around the country to relieve rebel-held castles and beat off the Welsh and Scots, and he marched through East Anglia. He was doing better than anyone could have imagined, winning back his kingdom castle by castle with incredible speed, and the momentum was turning in his favour. The Barnwell Chronicle says this, quote, "And wherever he came across the lands of his enemies in this march, he gave them over to plunder, and they were given over to burning and food for the flames, so that our age cannot remember such fires to have been made in our part of the world in so very short a space of time." End quote. It was a great, if brutal, comeback, and showed how brilliant he could be when his back was against the wall. And then, on the 19th of October, he got dysentery and he died. The rebels had been rebelling against John, and now that he had gone, their reasons for rebellion were suddenly a little hollow. With William Marshal now in control, he had John's son Henry crowned king. This was far from a foregone conclusion. Henry was only 9 years old, and it might have made more sense for everyone to go over to King Louis at this point. Instead, the remaining loyalists trusted William Marshal to steer them through the crisis. William was in his 80s at this point, but he was probably the most famous man in Christendom, and his competence was trusted. Certainly, he would not be charging around the country setting fire to your estates like John had been doing. William was effectively the regent. His contemporaries used the term Regis Rector et Regni, meaning keeper or guardian of king and realm. His exact powers and authority were unknown, but everyone knew he was in charge. Somehow, brilliant man that he was, he held it all together. Even so, the problems ahead were enormous. They had basically no money. Lords advised him to take the boy king and to flee to Ireland, for Louis was certainly in command of England. But John's death had changed the narrative, and that was what William played upon. Louis was no longer the defender of the traditional freedoms of the nobility, but a foreign usurper to an innocent boy king. Still, the facts on the ground could not be overcome by narrative alone. On paper, through the barons sworn to him, Louis ruled over 3/4 of the military forces of England, plus his 1,400 knights and so on that he'd brought over with him, plus even more French reinforcements who had come over since. On the other hand, keeping so many forces in arms was tearing through Louis's money, and he was robbing his lands on the continent to pay for it all. Also, the natives were growing restless. These foreign soldiers everywhere were ruining the country, and the English, the common folk, in some places started waging guerrilla war against the invaders. The focus of this was in the wild lands of the Weald in Kent, where a band caused great strife amongst the French forces. Their leader has come to be known as William of Cassingham, or Cassingham, a manor in the hundred of Rolvenden. The history of William Marshal calls him Willikin de Wowes, or Willie of the Weald. The details of this great hero are sketchy, to say the least. Some say he was a native Saxon squire who raised 1,000 archers to harass the French from the woods, and that he slew thousands of them. Other accounts suggest he was a Flemish mercenary with an official position working for the crown. In my Immortal Night novel, the character of Cassingham is an impoverished country squire and he's instrumental in saving England at this time. Anyway, this forgotten English hero, a real-life Robin Hood, deserves a video of his own, so we'll move on for now. The energy had gone out of the French invasion. Louis was running out of money and foreign support was not forthcoming. The Scots had kind of declined to help, the Welsh were useless, the Pope refused to back it, and Louis's father Philip didn't want to risk annoying, it was a new Pope, so he didn't throw his weight behind it either, even though he'd ordered it and made it happen initially. And the church in England, following the Pope, likewise backed the boy king rather than Louis. And Louis couldn't crack Dover, so he decided to abandon the siege and go around all the other smaller holdout castles to finish them off. And it's significant that despite the size of his armies, he couldn't do that and continue the siege of Dover. So we know he was struggling to some extent at this point. Still, he finally took the Tower of London after 14 months of siege, and then he went on to Hertford Castle, which surrendered. This was north of London, so capturing it meant keeping supply and communications open with the rebel forces in the north. Then he went west to Berkhamsted, another jumping off point for an advance in the north. This castle resisted and there was a proper medieval siege with siege engines and sallying forth by the defenders, but it fell to King Louis. From there he went northeast to take Headingham Castle in Suffolk, and then Colchester, Norwich and Orford all surrendered to the new French king. So since Henry III had been crowned, he'd lost 9 castles. And now the whole east of the country had joined the south in Louis's royal domain. So, riding high, but short of cash, Louis now intended to pop home to France for a bit to meet a papal diplomatic mission and to gather reinforcements to finish off his conquest of England. He marched towards the Sussex coast. However, William of Cassingham and his men, to quote from the Annals of Dunstable Priory, retreating into the woods, broke down the bridges behind Louis and laid ambushes so that he could not bring up supplies behind him. End quote. So King Louis found himself assailed by guerrilla forces and cut off, and this guerrilla campaign must have been done in coordination with William Marshal because there was a fleet of royalist warships offshore and the royalist forces closed in by land, and Louis was now trapped in the coastal town of Winchelsea. It's a nice little town today, but back then it was one of the most important ports in England. So now Louis couldn't leave by land or sea. His forces outside were terrorised by Cassingham's men in the woods beyond the town who cut off French heads and kept the French forces bottled up when they tried going out to forage or to escape. Maybe 1,000 Frenchmen were killed during this siege, but eventually some broke through to reach London, and then help came by land and sea to lift the siege, and Louis sailed home. He had escaped what would have been a disaster by the skin of his teeth, but the tide had now turned. The Royalists had almost won the war, there and then, and best of all, now Louis was out of the country. A few weeks before, he'd been in a position of strength, and his decision to pop home for a bit was perhaps understandable, but it had almost cost him his life, and now it threatened his kingdom. While he was away, the Marshal brought many of the rebels back into the fold, strengthening the young King Henry and weakening the absent King Louis. And while he worked on diplomacy, the Marshal also fought to regain lost ground. Louis had sworn to return to his kingdom in 7 weeks, so the Marshal had to work quickly to take Farnham and Winchester, and he started sieges of Southampton, Porchester, Chichester, Odiham, Rochester, Mount Sorrel and Ely. And then Louis came back. Some accounts say he returned with a large and powerful army, but others say he brought 140 knights and some mercenaries. He tried to land at Dover, but again Cassingham was there to attack the town and burn the camp, so instead he went up to Sandwich, losing some ships and men to English ships off the coast. In his anger, before he left, he set fire to Sandwich. Hardly the actions of a confident king. He was starting to act like John. Still, he rushed off to recover Winchester and to capture his rival for the throne, the boy King Henry, who was there. Louis took Winchester back, but he missed the young king, who had fled west to Marlborough, and Louis then went back to London. There were now multiple sieges going on all over the country, and the forces of both sides were divided. The situation was fluid and open to exploitation for the man willing to take risks. The great city and castle of Lincoln was under siege by rebel forces, and William Marshal decided to focus all his resources in a great battle. This was contrary to the careful strategy he'd employed thus far, but he was a great knight, a chivalric hero, as well as a canny politician, and whatever his reasons, he rolled the dice. Great big dice. The Royalists were keen to show the new king and all Christendom what they were made of. They wanted to prove themselves, especially perhaps the former rebels among them. Again, the Battle of Lincoln deserves a video all of its own, but suffice to say William Marshall and the Royalists were victorious, defeating a huge swathe of rebel forces. It was a stunning and momentous victory, but it didn't end the war. It was a huge battle in a war of sieges and raids though, and it showed that God was on Henry's side. But how to capitalise on this victory? A march on London? Relieve Dover, where Louis was still battering the walls? Well, when Louis heard about Lincoln, he rushed back to London and he sent letters home to his dad asking for help. We've all been there. Meanwhile, the Marshal focused his ships and men on the port town of Sandwich. The French fleet came in with vast numbers of men and supplies to support Louis in his time of need, and the English sailed out at just the right time. The wind and the tide had been judged beautifully, and there was a great clash where, of course, the English came out victorious. And it's significant as well because a naval battle like this was very rare in the medieval period, even one just offshore. They usually happened in ports or in harbours. This was a crushing defeat for Louis, and one he could not recover from. He was out of money and short on supplies when he heard of the defeat, and he sued immediately for peace. He gave up everything he held in exchange for going home with all his men at once. He was only too pleased to do so. And to sweeten the deal, the Marshal gave him 15,000 marks. Other sources say 10,000 marks, but whatever, it was a huge sum. Some people criticise the Marshal for letting the defeated Frenchmen off lightly, but the Marshal wanted it done, and he took the opportunity to pay off his enemies to secure the throne for the last king he would ever serve. As part of the deal, Louis renounced his claim to the throne of England, and he and his men were expelled. The history of William Marshal records that the French walked to the coast barefoot and in their underclothes, with only Louis allowed to keep his tunic. This humiliation may be one of the source's embellishments, but I like to think it's true. The Barnwell Chronicle has this to say, quote, "And this was as a miracle that the eldest son of the King of the French, having got deep inside the kingdom with such a mass of troops, having occupied so much of the kingdom, so many of the magnates having joined his party, was so swiftly removed, not to say expelled from the kingdom, with all his people, without hope of recovery." End quote. Indeed, it did seem like a miracle. William Marshal had saved England, and the French were gone. So whether you call it a rebellion, a civil war, an invasion, the events of 1216 and 17 deserve to be remembered in full, and that includes remembering the French King Louis I of England. So let me know if you want a William of Cassingham video and any other suggestions you might have. Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe.